Good morning. Today we'll actually get into the podcast recording business. Everybody's signed in, wonderful. But before we do get into podcast recording, I wanted to take a sort of general overview, maybe a review of all the things that or at least some of the things that we talked about last time, in terms of what it is that we can actually do with podcasts. And this could be thought of in multiple ways. I think sort of the most intuitive way is in terms of pedagogical objectives as instructors, right? So what kind of things do you want to be able to accomplish in class? The other side of the equation would be in terms of learning outcomes. So in other words, what kind of things do you want your students to be able to take away from your classroom, and how can podcasts facilitate that? Okay. So those are the two questions that I have. You have notes from our last meeting. Those would be helpful. If not, it should be pretty common sense in order to facilitate this brief discussion. I want you to go to menti.com, which we should all be pretty familiar with right now. Any Internet Connect device would do. And then type the code 621223. So remember, we talked about grammar, we talked about vocabulary, we talked about scales, we talked about culture, we talked about pragmatics, prosody. Listening comprehension, okay. Pronunciation, cultural knowledge. The more specific you are, the better it may be, and I think the way this is configured is that it accepts multiple answers.
Oh, this is different from the previous website that you...
Yes.
So I cannot...
Let me go back.
And you should be able to resubmit.
Oh, okay.
Could you allow me to respond to you?
Well, it just maybe you could supplement the textbook. Supplement in more likely and customized additions. Consider the themes, of culture.
Practice a specific theme, semantic field by having students read a podcast episode. Okay, so it's from the student point
That's
of view.
not mine. I cannot. It says you have already voted on this question. That must be Chris.
That must be Chris, okay.
So we can't go back.
Okay, well, but we can add to it, since there's only a couple of us today, we can definitely take it as a point of departure and add to it as we see fit, right? So listening comprehension, that would of course be listening skills. And how could podcasts assist with that specifically?
Well, by using real discourse, real language,
Okay, so authentic input.
then students are exposed to different kinds of listening, and therefore to try to comprehend all these different kinds of accents and what because it's real language, it's authentic input.
I think one advantage of podcasts over other listening comprehension exercises, at least as a student, I found doing listening comprehension to be, you have to go to the computer, you have to get the CD, you have to set it all up, and it's not that fun. This is more integrated with what we typically do, so you could listen to a podcast while you're walking, or you could, it's just more integrated into our daily lives, whereas listening comprehension assignment is like clearly homework. This can function as homework, or it can be like a supplement for your own edification. So
what you're saying is that when using the podcast technology, we should try to do something that is more podcast-like, instead of just saying, oh, how can I do listening comprehension with this? Because you can do listening comprehension without a need. So I would say, since the idea is often that you're going to have a dialogue to people, because it feels more natural. And it's true that a lot of the podcasts that I listen to, not knowing they were podcasts, because I was just listening to radio or listening to stuff on the internet. But they are actually, they call themselves podcasts. Many of them have dialogues. So I was thinking, if you're going to, as a teacher, going to record your own podcast, you should just take advantage of this like chatty type of interaction. Maybe you can have a man and a woman, or people with two different accents, if you want to enrich it. And having people maybe from different regions who are going to come from, if you're talking about cultural knowledge, the nice thing when you have a dialogue, why it's not fun, or it's not interesting to have two people agree on everything. So you could introduce some kind of diverse points of views. And I was thinking cultural, so if you want to, maybe to make it easier for the students, you can follow the themes in your textbook or in your syllabus, and just have these, these conversations on the theme, having different points of view.
As the supplement of
Supplement or enrichment.
So definitely pragmatic structure, definitely discourse, right? And having your students exposed to these different layers that are not your vocabulary, grammar, pronunciations, or more traditional classroom-related ideas or dimensions.
Yeah, don't do the same things. Just try and do something different.
building on what you're saying, Pascal, I think that when you have a listening comprehension that's produced by a textbook company, for example, that's a dialogue, because there are plenty of dialogues, but they're very unnatural. It's not the way that two people typically speak with one another. Whereas in a podcast, the students would get experience hearing how an actual conversation with all of the different interruptions or false starts or conversational turns take place in that language. So I think that adds to your point.
But if you're going to create one just for the students, you're still going to adjust it to the level of comprehension. So it would be, maybe you would sort of think of the words that you need to use in the podcast so that they can be used as anchors. You don't need to modify the way you speak in a way that can become unnatural, but you have to make sure that you have these recognizable things that students can latch onto. But you could feel much more natural than something that's even. And also, when you have contradictions or different points of view in a textbook, they never go very far, or you could explore the diversity of things, because cultural is not at all monolithic.
That's interesting that you say that, because it seemed to me that the podcast, part of the reasoning behind the podcast, it is not to produce something that is like create these dialogues where students will look at these certain things. I may be wrong, but it seems to me that it's really natural.
Well, real podcasts, like radio podcasts, they're really about the content. As language teachers, we have to look at the vehicle as well.
Right.
So we have to be sure that it's understandable, that it's clear, comprehensible, and also the ideas, if they clash a bit, they should be resolved, or at least presented in a very clear way. You can't just have like a natural conversation that usually goes nowhere. So you have to plan it, but it can, because it has to be informative. Just as radio podcasts, they they tend to want to end someplace where there's some, I mean, you feel that, you know, you've learned something, or you've communicated some recognizable ideas. So it has to be planned a bit.
I was also thinking that sort of that ties in what Chris is saying and what you're saying too, and that is that the podcast is becoming increasingly pronounced in cultural discourse of the target language, target culture that you are engaging with, right? And as such, there's also conversation that surrounds certain podcasts. People talk about these things. And as podcasts become more and more popular, these conversations also become more and more pronounced and more and more visible, which is another thing or another sort of dimension could be added to instruction that reflects the culture, reflects values, reflects the discourse that is around podcasts that could be brought into the classroom.
But then they would have to be around real podcasts. I mean, real, meaning podcasts about content. You know, not created for a class. If you want to have a conversation, you have to have a conversation about an authentic object. And whatever we create for our classes is going to be like semi-authentic.
Or, you know, it could be simplified version of something that is more current and more authentic in that sense. Yes, Chris.
I think maybe in order to address this issue, you could say that you can use different podcasts for different purposes. So you could say, all right, listen to the podcast that we created and see if you can get maybe 70% or 80% of what they're saying. Then listen to this podcast that, listen to this podcast that is a podcast that's found in nature, that we found somewhere that French people listen to or Portuguese speakers listen to, and see if you can get maybe 30% of it. And we would have a different frame for it.
Are you going back?
Yes.
Okay.
But then we're talking about recording.
Oh, yes, sure.
This is what I was thinking. You would have to be like a very good debater and thinker and someone with like deep ideas. Not saying we never have those, but to create a pedagogical podcast that is capable of generating a real discussion. You know? And if we start with these kinds of expectations, we're probably not going to start at all, because you know, how can I just say something that is like that clever and that new?
Well, yeah, from the standpoint of instructors or even students being creators of podcasts, which is something that we'll get into, or starting getting into today, hopefully, God willing, and we will be progressively getting more into in subsequent weeks. You know, so that would be is definitely a consideration, but looking at the stuff that's already available, like Chris said, even though not all of it might be suitable for all proficiency levels, so that we need to be scaffolded. One of the easiest ways to do it would be just how much of it do you actually get, how much of it do you actually understand, right? But you know, this in and of itself could be used as a lens, as a cultural lens, to see what topics are sort of discussed, what themes are present within social discourse at the moment, how these things are debated, how they're reflected, what is the sort of common opinion about them, and why.
I would say that would be the most useful at an advanced level.
Sure. Is there a way to adapt it to the less advanced level?
Adapted to
Wait, come again?
Adapt it to a level, proficiency level that is not advanced. And in other words, is there a way that you can think of, I don't have an answer to this question, is there a way you can think of that you can have your beginner, intermediate students begin talking about podcasts, or getting into using that to sort of get into how one can participate in a national conversation or a cultural conversation that is, you know, larger than just a theme in a textbook, and that is something that is currently, you know, happening in the culture that you're learning. If my question makes any sense.
So they will produce podcasts now. And,
No.
um,
No, I think what he's saying is that if we can use the podcast at all different levels, not only at the advanced, and I'm having trouble with that because I use YouTube a lot in the classroom, and especially for the elementary levels, it is very difficult for them to understand. And we have a topic that we are talking about clothes. There is a YouTube clip where not kids, but people their own age, like between 17 and 21, talk about what they like to wear,
Okay.
clothes. And there are some things that they understand, but there are many things that they don't understand. So it seems to me that in those cases, the podcast would need to be just like Pascal was saying, and that's what I see there. That's what I see the debate between the authentic and the not so authentic. That it would have to be planned with certain things that our students can understand,
So
or
structured.
to be able to find podcasts that are really very, because when you use authentic language, it's very difficult not to get into all the pauses and the repeating words, etc., that for them are not, they don't know.
And then really idiomatic expressions that they drop here, other contractions.
The only way I can see that is if we would work on that authentic podcast and make
like a judgment.
In a
No,
transcript.
a transcript.
And then with notes. And
If I am in that kind of situation, let's say we're talking about clothes, but then the video is in the advanced level, I'll probably ask them to focus on the comment.
well, if you have video that's at the elementary level, really helps to know.
Or
Many of the themes actually we're studying are very visual, like clues. I mean, very tactile and visual, like, it's easy to talk about food if you can see it. It would be better if you could eat it, but I mean, at least you can see it. Same thing with clothes, same thing with activities, you need to see that, somebody windsurfing,
Okay, that really points towards the next theme, which would be probably videos. But for now, we're only dealing with the oral layer.
There is a series of, it's not podcasts, I don't know how to describe this, it's called Audio.
Okay.
You have these very, very short snippets, about 2 minutes. Usually the people who speak are children.
So this one was produced for language instruction.
It's for language instruction, but it sounds like the type of thing that a child who's rehearsed a little bit, would be able to say. So it has an authentic feel, but it's very, very simple. And I use that at the elementary level, and the students can really understand, yes, that's the one. And it's very nice. There are lots of them that keep creating new ones.
So that's why my
I don't know whether that's a podcast.
There would not be a podcast. No, is it automatically pushed into your device?
No.
No, you have to access it, right? So it's not.
But this is a very good, what do you call it?
It's a good resource.
In the interest of time, I'd like to move forward. And so there's a few things that we did mention by ways of pedagogical objectives and things that could be accomplished with podcasts, either as our own creation or as something that could be found on the internet. What I did for today is I prepared a list of podcast episodes. And all of they each focus on a different pedagogical objective. They're all in different languages. I would like you guys to choose one. And the first step would be to find it. And to find it, to look for it, you could use some of the tools, some of the apps that we have discussed in the previous weeks.
Simon, am I blocking the camera?
No.
So you can use podcasts, which you find in podcasts,
Or
or you just put it there and you find it.
which one?
It's good to get the information.
we don't have one in Portuguese.
There's one in Spanish. of you are coming.
Found it.
Okay, as you're looking for them and so you're listening to them, think of which pedagogical objective or objectives this podcast or this episode hits, and which ones it sort of falls short on, why, and how could these shortcomings, in your opinion, be addressed?
Where can I find it? In iTunes?
That would be one of the platforms. iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher,
But for Spotify, you have to have Spotify.
You have to have Spotify,
I don't have it.
or Google Store. iTunes would be a default for you.
But you have to
So once you found the podcast series, find the episode too.
I would look for it like that, links in the search page.
So are you looking for in the library or in the store? You can switch the store. And then look at that. Yes, slow Spanish. Sure. And then you are looking for most recent episode. So in the very top.
I have some thoughts about the incontri tagliato process.
I think this would be enough. It's been about 5 minutes. You guys should have a pretty good idea about what the podcast did or what it didn't do. So I wrote the 3 questions that I posed on the wall right there. Which pedagogical objectives does this podcast reflect or address? Which objectives does it fall short on, and why, if any? And how would you address these shortcomings if you have identified them? Chris, would you like to start?
So my podcast was the number 4, Encontro Italiano podcast. And it definitely is targeting some grammar structures, rather complex ones that a beginner would not be able to do, but it's clearly a pedagogical creation. So in that sense, if you want to ask a student to listen to this specific thing, then you could. But it falls short on the objective of being engaging. Like, I wanted to injure myself at the end of it because it was one of these artificial situations, like the grandfather saying, oh, when I was your age. I think that a podcast is more effective when the person is speaking as themselves rather than doing. And so I think in addressing the shortcoming, I might not ask my students to listen to this podcast. I might choose one that's maybe a news podcast or an opinion podcast, and not one that's a podcast that's formulated as a pedagogical tool, per se. That's what I think.
I have this similar experience with Chris, I think. So this is more to like.
And which one did you listen to?
The Plaza one. So it's more like the cultural knowledge, and it's not really good for intermediate or elementary or even intermediate student, only for advanced student, because this is basically talking about one product of Indonesia and some critical analysis on the development of this industry. So probably not. I'm not going to use it to introduce some grammatical aspect, but probably different from Chris's podcast is that this is more natural because this is like a radio interview compared to anything else.
So the difference is that where the difference lies within the authenticity.
Yes.
For Chris, for you, it was too authentic for beginners and intermediate students, but it would be okay for advanced students, right?
It's okay, and you can even hear the accent of the lady is actually a Japanese accent.
Okay, so this is actually very interesting. It's something you probably would not encounter in materials or structure that come with the textbook, right? You have the different regional variations or the regional dialects. For Chris, it was structured, it was scaffolded, but it was done so to the point where it was artificial and not entertaining, so kind of productive in a way too.
I thought that this could be used for intermediate.
And which one did you listen to?
6, using plus Spanish. But it seemed to me it was not authentic.
It was not
in the sense
authentic.
that people doesn't speak that way.
Okay. So there is a danger, right, within
Oh yeah.
scaffolding, structuring. You want to make sure that your students understand it, but also you don't want to go overboard with it to the point where you're exposing them to the kind of comprehensible input that is not authentic anymore.
And so the shortcomings are that really there is no context in terms of how, because this talks about these stores in La Coruña.
Okay.
They would, they're trying to, the owners of the store are trying to make the clients make payments on cash on machines. And so the workers are preoccupied with the fact that they're going to be losing jobs.
Okay.
They're going to be putting these machines. So it seems to me that in that sense, for an intermediate to get into that topic, without having context, that would be definitely a shortcoming. So that would have to be done by doing a reading or something on that specific news, or so they can really relate to whatever they're listening.
So essentially scaffolding and pre-listening activities, exercises,
This
things.
is okay because whenever you want to use the method of document in a smooth way,
I think in your case, or in case of this particular podcast, the one difficulty that is that I noticed with it lies with the fact that it deals with current events. So whatever it is that you are, however it is that you are conceiving of your curriculum, you need to factor in the element of unpredictability. So you don't know what the next podcast is going to be about, right? If you want to use the most recent one, then you need to find a way on how to inject it into your curriculum, into your syllabus.
One thing actually that can be a problem with using these real podcasts and podcasts that are unpredictable is just the time constraint. I mean, when it means you have to produce an exercise very quickly, you have to have time, in between the time when the podcast comes out and when you sit in class to prepare something decent. So either you do minimal preparation, it's basically how much did you understand and still have a topic, which is a possibility, or you're not going to spend a lot of time preparing a very sophisticated exercise because you have to throw it away.
So in that case, yeah, I mean, if you're talking about listening comprehension and comprehension for meaning, then obviously this would be something that you need some time preparing for. Are there any other layers of communication that perhaps won't require as much scaffolding with these unpredictable topics where the current events podcast could be used to emphasize?
I mean, I've used short videos again, short programs on French television. There's the local Paris region channel that is totally accessible. I mean, there's no restriction where you are. And they have this really micro news with a text and short video. And it's very, very short and very contained. And I've interviews with famous people who are preparing an exhibition of their works, basically. And that's great because you can see the work. And then you have a few simple questions. The journalists, I mean, they don't have that much imagination. Usually say, okay, so where does it come from? And when did you start doing this? And so many of the questions are like the who, what, how, when types of questions, and you can just very quickly say, okay, so who, what, when, and it takes like literally 10 minutes to prepare, and you show it to the students twice, and you all group together, and you point, to the words that we've just discovered, last week. And with a little bit of luck, you can actually do something quite good with, very, very short time of preparation. But that images, and it's easy because
Okay, we'll get back to that. Okay, so that's one example in which we can scaffold podcast.
Pass.
That we can scaffold a podcast. What I would like you to do now is think about one didactic objective for learning or teaching, learning from your student perspective, teaching from you as a perspective of you as an instructor, to realize in your own class. It could be something that you wanted to do today and didn't really know how to do it, or maybe you want to do it in the future at some point. And also, then think about if this objective that you just considered has been reflected in the podcast that you have selected and listened to. If it hasn't been, how could it have been included? And if yes, and if indeed it was present in the podcast that you listened to, was it delivered okay? Could its delivery be improved, and if so, how? Does it make sense? We'll take a couple minutes to think about that.
This conversation is making me think that the way that you would use a podcast and the way you would use dynamic audio are very different.
I think that was a
And I didn't really appreciate that. I think that one possible function of a podcast is that you could ask students to listen for conversational functions. How I want to speak. So things like asking for clarification, interrupting, disagreeing, disagreeing, unrespectful, that kind of thing can be elicited on a podcast. And you can't easily get it from standard didactic materials. So that kind of thing is not. But it's very important.
Listening to that, it was about the man who had left her. Wow, just get up and go. You're better than that. Go loud. Have fun. Or just, wallow in your misery for a month and then stop. So it's very provoking and it's a bit we want to react because they've all had friends like us.
What is a question? What is a comment? What is an explanation? All these sort of dimensions that could be understood without necessarily vocabulary.
Yes.
Well, the other sucks, I don't know.
Again, that doesn't help with
Plus
explanation.
we have,
I think that
we
one
have
of the
several
disadvantages
levels,
of
so we have
podcasts
some,
is
like
there's
some
a
that
lot
are
of
like poetry.
volume, a lot
Everybody
of
can
content.
use them.
So
And then you have,
maybe for other
yeah, but
things,
pop songs
a
like it's the
pedagogical audio produced in the lab would be
One
something
time.
that
absolutely
a greater focus
But
of
you
form
have
is
the whole
useful.
variety, almost
there.
of things that are.
It was a podcast that would be overwhelming if you were trying to pay attention to all the
But
grammatical
with
structures. You
twists
can't really
and
rewind.
with puns
I mean, you can,
and
but
with humor.
that's not really
And
something
you
like
have things
the
with
point of a
lots
podcast is to
and
kind
the
of
text
flow.
become very complicated.
Are we ready? Okay, so
I have this experience, so this morning, I basically have this bunch of recording file that I asked my friend to send me via WhatsApp. They're introducing themselves, their phone number, their address. Now what happened this morning is actually, I'm focusing, well, the objective was actually to listen to the phone number and then the introduction of themselves, what is their job. But what's interesting is
I don't understand the objective. Is that like students will be able to introduce themselves, students will be able to recognize phone numbers? Is that okay?
And what interesting is that this friend of mine recorded her recording by stating what is her job and what she likes from her job and what she dislikes from her job. I actually wanted it to be developed into a writing activity, but it turned out to be a speaking activity because the time was up. And yeah, I should have taught them to use the word like I could have, when facing things that they don't like in their job. Yeah.
The objective in this case, it appears because it's Spanish from Spain, will be the listening of the learning of the pedagogical portion.
Okay.
And so it appears a lot, and so definitely it is reflected, but it is reflected only because it's Spanish from Spain. Latin American Spanish, we will not hear as many times as it appears in Spanish from Spain. And so, how can it be improved? I really don't know because they use it a lot. So I don't see if we could see a way of improving.
You mean in the news?
In the
news.
in the podcast.
Any ideas how we can make the pedagogical feature more visible, salient, contextualized? Because we are talking about the use of instance.
For me, it would be probably, but it wouldn't be in the podcast. It would have to be an activity outside of the podcast, where you compare to how those times that it's being used in continental Spanish, you will be used in Latin American
They could
Spanish.
recast it in like Mexican Spanish.
Yeah.
You know, how would a Mexican say this?
we're asking the same question to a continental Spanish-speaking person versus a Latin American Spanish-speaking person, and seeing how the different tenses are being used, right? Or maybe there are instances where certain tense will be used by a speaker from continental Europe versus, a situation in the past where a different tense would be used, and juxtapose these two by asking specific questions that would elicit these forms.
Well, when we look for authentic materials, we either look for authentic materials all the time because our brains are configured like that as language teachers. We're always on the lookout or always listening for something that might be useful for us, and then the use becomes apparent. Oh, I could use this for that. Or you're desperately looking for a nice activity for tomorrow's class, and so you go on the internet and say, I'm going to type in this keyword and see what comes up, and maybe I find the pearl that's hidden there. And so I'm not sure you need to start from a didactic objective necessarily. Very often it's the reverse that happens. You just listen to something and say, oh, I could use this for that.
Okay.
Yeah, it happens
Sure.
with music. I cannot listen to music without
Thinking, oh, could I use
I
this?
can use that for that.
Yeah. It's often like this.
Well, the reason why I structured this particular exchange this way is
Yeah, because
because
we have
of
a podcast all over.
the punchline. So what I would like you to do now is think about a podcast that would address the above and write 1 and 2 sentences introducing it to your colleagues. It could be in English. So the shortcomings that you've, yes. So a certain didactic objective that you've identified. How it could be recast, how it could be improved on, how it could be reintroduced, done better. And then if you were to make your own podcast featuring that particular objective, how would you then introduce it to your colleagues?
We just added that.
Yeah. I'm essentially asking to write a spoof for a podcast. So for instance,
Then you have to create a situation.
well, but I mean, what I'm looking for is something like, in this episode of my podcast, we will look into how different, how speakers of Indonesian on different islands in the country use different words or use for the same, items or use different expressions. And we will do that by listening to a dialogue.
Are you asking us to think about a specific podcast that already exists, or even an imaginary one?
Something that you would record on your own.
So that think about a podcast wouldn't be an existing one.
Oh no, I should have.
So it
I
would
understand
be-
that
okay.
confusion. No, yes, it would be no.
How would you
Something that
create
that you would create on your own. Yeah, nothing that exists. I mean, it might exist for all we know, but
Mhm.
we're not getting to recording today.
Well, I was thinking of something that already does exist, but in our conversation, it's emerged for me that one of the advantages of podcasts is that it allows you to address discursive features of language, such as asking for clarification, interrupting, disagreeing respectfully, disagreeing unrespectfully, agreeing forcefully, tepidly, and this is not really in textbooks. So. And then you asked me to think of a podcast. I was thinking of one of the most popular podcasts, which is the Joe Rogan Experience. And these podcasts are structured as a hang, where you just hang out for 3 hours, and different topics emerge. But one topic that's been emerging a lot is there's a person who's promoting a diet, which is the beef-only diet, so eat nothing but beef. And Joe Rogan does not think that this is a good diet, so he very forcefully disagreed with this person. And then the following podcast, he got a nutritionist who said, yes, this is a terrible diet, don't have it, and he was agreeing the whole time. So I think that if you were thinking about the topic of agreeing and disagreeing, you could listen to maybe a 5-minute chunk of the first episode and then a 5-minute chunk of the later episode and say, okay, how does the host agree with the nutritionist and how does he disagree with this person who's not qualified in any nutritional capacity about the beef-only diet? And it's culturally relevant too, because a lot of people have said, oh yes, the beef-only diet, I've started doing it and it works really well. And maybe it does for a very short time, but eventually you have serious problems. But I think that way you can focus in on a discursive feature. And that could also be applied to a podcast that you create yourself and not one that already exists.
The argument clinic, I want to fight it. Yeah, I mean, if we start with what I'm going to teach next week, which is one of the past tenses. So I could have imagine kind of dialogue, two people saying what they ate yesterday. But I mean, it's not going to be very interesting. So.
Which is okay for now. All we need is a bit to actually record. The idea behind it was to take these 2 sentences with us to the recording booth, which we don't have the time for, and see if we can record some material today so we can have something to work on next time, but we can also do it next week.
Yeah.
Okay, so getting back to the discursive feature, let's say the topic is the ideal diet. And you tell 2 students, okay, the topic is the ideal diet, and then you speak really what you actually think the ideal diet is.
You need to find a real discussion topic.
Well, I think that
Feel
could,
strongly about
I think people do feel
Krispy
strong.
Kreme diet,
Yeah.
it's really good.
And then you could have different students talking, 2 students saying what they think the ideal diet is, and then, so they can agree to some extent. So, I mean, see if they agree or disagree, but then say, all right, try to develop the agreement part or the disagreement part. How will you disagree with your partner? How will you agree?
So if you go back to the point we're making that some podcasts become national conversations, we can see how we can just steal these very controversial ideas in order to do our own class.
But also just, agreeing and disagreeing will have to be done within the register of the podcast. But then of course could be extrapolated later into, other spheres of life, right? Classroom, but also beyond. And thinking in terms of the actual skills, can do statements, we can apply that to workplace conversations. We can apply that to conversations with host families if a student chooses to go abroad, and so on and so forth. And it all starts with authentic podcasts and seeing how people actually do it in real life. That is absent from constructed textbooks. Well, we're not going to go to recording, so that will have to wait until the next week. It is 3:30, so we're at the end of our meeting today. And that's all I got for you.